Hello, I'm Vivienne McGrath from beingunbeatable.com, and this video is my best self-help book guide 2018. These are the books that saved and changed my life. The top personality development books of 2018, starting with my personal top 10. I'm going to have to read a little bit from my piece of paper because it's quite an intense and involved list. But first, I was in an abusive relationship, and leaving that relationship was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. On average, I believe it takes 7 times before a person will leave an abusive relationship. It is that hard. In fact, I didn't even know I was in an abusive relationship for a long time because emotional abuse can be very confusing. It's no wonder it's called coercive control, because you're like a frog in boiling water. By the time you realize that it is an emotional abuse, it's too late. You're already ground down. You're already so affected, it becomes very, very difficult to leave. And when I finally realized and admitted, which was another really hard thing to do, admitted that I needed help and I was in an abusive relationship, I first went to a self-help group, and that was incredible and really supportive. I realized I wasn't crazy, I wasn't alone. But then I started to read every single self-help book I can lay my hands on. And back then there weren't that many, actually. Most of them were quite dense. They were written by psychologists only, never survivors or people like me. But they were incredibly helpful because they were like a mirror. I always say this mantra: when the student is ready, the teacher comes. And so those books were for me. When I was ready, each one of those books came along and I read them, and it was like a mirror being held up to myself, and it taught me something new about myself. And I still read them every now and again, even today. Suddenly, I'm ready to hear the next bit about myself, because recovery, it's not an overnight thing. It takes time. It's like peeling an onion layer by layer, little by little. And my recovery has been like that. But self-help books have been absolutely brilliant for me. So this is my top 10 self-help books. And the first one is Women Who Love Too Much by Robin Norwood. Oh my God, that was the first one I ever read. And I remember one of the first lines in that book: when being in love means being in pain, you're loving too much. God, I cried when I read that, because it did. It hurt so much. I loved so much and I loved so deeply, but it was equally as painful. And I sort of measured my love by the depth of torment I felt. And I didn't realize that that wasn't love. That's not healthy. That's a toxic, unhealthy form of love and a relationship. And Robin Norwood was a psychologist or psychiatrist who dealt with many, many, many women. And she started to see a pattern of behavior in them that was the same. That it was all these women who just, no matter how much that person in the relationship abused them and hurt them, they kept going back. They kept feeling sorry. They kept forgiving them and going back. So she also talked about how that clearly was something awry within you that makes you keep doing that. So while I was always looking outward at the relationship and how I could fix it, try and fix it, rescue my ex and do all that, she was the one that made me realize there were flaws in me. And it was quite liberating, because I realized, okay, I can't change him, but if I know what's wrong with me, I can change me. And that was a huge light bulb moment for me. And once I realized that, I realized I had the power within me to change my life. So she was instrumental for me. That was an incredible book. And it's been translated into millions of languages. It's still selling around the world many, many years later. It's a brilliant book. And it was so good that so many women like me wrote to her, flooded her with emails saying, not emails back then, it was letters back then, that her book resonated so much that she then followed it up with a book called Letters from Women Who Love Too Much. So it really is an amazing read. The second one, another one that I read back then, is Codependent No More. How to Stop Controlling Others and Caring for Yourself. And that is by Melody Beattie. That was another one that was really enlightening for me because it made me realize that, again, my relationship was what's called codependency. He was addicted to, had his own addictions to, say, alcohol, drugs, or whatever. A person is like that. And a codependent is somebody who has an addiction to that person that is unavailable to them because of their addictions. So you're addicted to an emotionally unavailable person, a person who is never, ever going to fulfill your needs. And the reason you are addicted to them is because you actually have this deep insecurity inside you, this lack of self-esteem. And while you go into a relationship with somebody who you deem in your head to be needier than you, more damaged than you, although you don't realize this consciously, there's somebody that you can control and rescue and save. Therefore, you can deny the fact that actually you're flawed, you have insecurities, and you're the one who needs saving, and you need to look at yourself. So you are controlling them. You're trying to control somebody that you feel is in need of you. But really, that's just denying the fact that you need to actually, it's a smokescreen. It stops you addressing the fact that you actually have an incredible low self-esteem. And that's why you're in a relationship with somebody else who's damaged. Your baggage matches, if you like. Number 3 is adult children of emotionally immature parents. How to heal from distant, rejecting, or self-involved parents. And that's by Dr. Lindsay Gibson. This is a book that I've only just read recently, actually. And it was when I was ready to read it. I was ready to hear it. And it was a really enlightening book because I'm from a very happy childhood, a very normal family, if you like. But there was some elements of dysfunction, and I did have a parent that was quite controlling. And in a way, I was the child of emotionally immature parents, because while they were wonderful at giving me everything I needed, taking care of me, I was educated brilliantly, they fed me, they clothed me and all that. They weren't great at expressing emotion. They're from very Victorian attitudes that you don't talk about emotions, you don't share that, you don't hug your children. They're from the generation that's children are seen, not heard. And so in a way, my emotional needs weren't met. And that does affect you as you grow up to be an adult. And this book explains that really well. That if your needs are not met as a child, you develop this hole inside, which is like this emotional loneliness, this feeling you're not good enough, you don't belong. And it informs everything, including your adult relationships. Because you don't feel you're good enough, you go into a relationship where you're not treated as good enough. And it becomes a search in a way. You're replicating your childhood because you're finding someone who's like your parent And you think that if I can keep changing my behavior and I can keep doing this or that and the other, then they will eventually love me and fulfill the needs like they never did when I was a child. The problem is you pick somebody who is as emotionally immature as you are, because that's been passed down to you, and they're never going to be able to fulfill your needs. So you're in this relationship that is very immature and dysfunctional. So it's very good at explaining where that comes from. Now the next book, number 4, Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, Lundy or Lundy Bancroft. He's a counsellor who specialises in working with abusive men. So he has this incredible access to abusive men. And what he's done with this book is he's taken that access and written an incredible guide for women that explains how you can recognize when a man is controlling you. And therefore you can see the signs, understand the warning signs, and realize that it is a toxic relationship. So that's a brilliant one from a completely the male perspective. I found that a really interesting book. Number 5, Will I Ever Be Good Enough? Dr. Carol McBride. Now, this is another one that I've read recently, and this is Healing Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers. Very similar to Emotionally Immature Parents, but it's very much more specifically about daughters with narcissistic mothers and the effect it has on her as she grows up. That real sense of not being good enough, that embedding of this critical inner voice that starts to inform your life. You hear your mother in your head and you're trying to forever live up to this mother. And it manifests in 2 different ways. I've actually done another video. I'll put the link below because I've done another video very specifically about this book and how it manifests, that you either become an overachiever and you're constantly seeking, you've got to be more and more and more and more and more successful, always got to prove you're good enough because you're always seeking that approval of your mother. Or you're an underachiever and you give up, and that can lead to self-harm and turning inwardly with eating disorders, self-harm, anorexica, that sort of thing. So that's another one that's very good at understanding the roots of why we end up in dysfunctional relationships as adults. Number 6, Louise Hay's You Can Heal Life. You Can Heal Your Life. This is a woman who was one of the founders of the self-help movement 30 years ago, and 30 years on, this book is still going strong. And it was one of those ones as well that was really instrumental for me in understanding that the power is within you. As long as you're willing to put the work in that you need to, you can heal yourself. You can turn your life around. You can change you. And Louise Hay is living proof of that because her book came from the fact that she suffered from instability and abuse when she was young herself. And I'm living proof of that you can change your life. It does come from within you. So I love that book. That's Louise Hay. And number 7 is Dr. Susan Forward, Men Who Hate Women and Women Who Love Them. Now, this is not just about the men in toxic relationship, but she also talks about how we as women play a role in that dysfunctional relationship as well. Because in a way, like attracts like. The abusive partner, the women, the men who hate women, they are lacking in self-esteem, they are insecure, and they project that hatred of themselves onto us. But then as women who are attracted to men in those sorts of relationships, women who love men who hate women, we are also lacking in self-esteem, and We are seeking men who we deem to be damaged in some way that we can go and rescue and save. To deny the fact that actually we need to work on ourselves, that we are lacking in self-esteem and have issues as well as they do. While we can focus on what we deem to be their issues that we think we need to rescue and save, actually we can deny the fact that it's us who need saving, as I said before. So that's a really good book because it really highlights the both sides of that equation. And another one that does that brilliantly is my number 8. That's the human magnet syndrome. And this is by Ross Rosenberg. And it's why we love people who hurt us. And I love that name, flicking my paper there. I love that name, the human magnet syndrome, because in a way it is. You know, I remember that pull I felt towards my ex. It was magnetic. I felt when I met him that he was the one. I don't know why, it just felt right to me. And even after abuse, I felt so sorry for him. I felt sorrier for him than me. And I just kept feeling that pull back to him. And I found it very, very, very hard to leave. And he talks about what is that magnetic pull. And it is the fact that narcissists who have a grandiose sense of entitlement and inflated sense of ego actually have a very fragile, vulnerable core and inner self, and that they don't want anyone to see. They've got to guard that at all costs with this inflated ego. And they do that by feeding off others that can make them feel good about themselves. And the perfect person to do that is the one who is attracted to them like a magnet, which is somebody who fits, somebody who has an absolute abundance of empathy, somebody who is also lacking in self-esteem to a great degree, but who is almost has this void of shame that just doesn't feel good enough. And the way they feel good enough and hides that void of shame is to pour it as empathy onto somebody else, a narcissist who will take and take and take as we give and give and give. And it's like a bucket. The narcissist has a bucket that has holes in it. And as we keep trying to fill them with our empathy and our love, it just keeps pouring out, and they need more and more and more and more. They actually suck us dry. But it is this sort of weird baggage that matches, and like a magnet, we're pulled together. And it's a similar void of shame, but we have different reasons. The narcissist wants to suck us dry, wants to supply somebody to feed off, and we are empaths who have an abundance of empathy. We're so willing to put the needs of somebody else above our own, so we can deny the fact that we are needy and insecure ourselves. Number 9, Dr. Brené Brown. Now, she's a really interesting one. She's got many books now, but the one I've put here is The Gifts of Imperfection. Let go of who you think you're supposed to be and embrace who you are. When Brené Brown did a TEDx talk, she felt so embarrassed after and thought, oh my God, have I made a fool of myself? But she was talking about shame and vulnerability and how we see vulnerability in ourselves as shameful, but in others we see it as courage. And she really wants us to look at shame and vulnerability in a different way. And she talks about everyone's need to belong and authenticity. She studies all these things. And this book is great at talking about the fact that we have that critical inner voice that we see as shame. We're never good enough. We don't belong. But only when we can find our authentic, true self and let go of shame and realize that being vulnerable can also be brave and courageous and can change our lives, then we can take those imperfections that we think we have and we can turn our lives around into a better one. And I absolutely agree with that. I've written many posts about that, actually, how you just rewrite your story. That critical inner voice, that's just a story. It's not who you are. It comes from all those things that were embedded in you as a child when your emotional needs weren't met or whatever. And you can change your life. You can rewrite it. And all of these books, oh, I haven't said number 10, have I? All of these books have changed my life. And the 10th one, I'm going to be really cheeky now, a bit of shameless self-promotion, because I'm going to say my book, because I'm a TV producer. I've had a very, very successful career making documentaries for British, American and Australian broadcasters. But now I'm finally telling my own story, and that is that I am a survivor of domestic violence. My ex almost killed me. And that day when he put his hands around my neck and strangled me and told me in really nasty terms to die and stared at me with these cold black eyes, I thought I was going to die that day. And the journey I've had to turn my life around from being a young single mother to a very successful TV producer to being married now to a wonderful man for 30 years now who brings out the best in me has been a very long journey, in part through all those other books. But now I'm ready to tell my own story. I've been doing that for years as a documentary filmmaker. So my story is Unbeatable: How I Left a Violent Man. And that book is going to be coming out very soon. And I know it will really help you because it is the steps that I took, step by step by step, of how I understood I was in an abusive relationship, the dynamics of how a narcissist controls you, how the cycle of abuse works, and how you can break that cycle, cut that tie. Look back to your childhood and your past to see where those roots of shame and insecurity came from and how to change it, rewrite your story, turn your life around and no longer feel shame and vulnerability, but use that as courage to become unbeatable. And that's what I've done. So that's my top 10 best self-help books 2018. And on my blog post at beingunbeatable.com, I have also listed a whole lot more under various categories, such as narcissistic relationships, dysfunctional families, divorcing a narcissist, living with a narcissist, self-help books for men, self-help books for women, just personal development books to make you more effective and successful in your life. I've got tons of books listed in my guide to self-help books. I'll put all the links to those 10 books that I've just mentioned below as well. So there you have it. I hope you can have a read of them. And don't be afraid to admit that you need help. That's the first step to recovery, admitting it and seeking help. Because once you do that and you realize that the power is in with you to change it, then that's the hardest step. And then after that, you just keep taking one after the other after the other. And please look for my book, Unbeatable, How I Left a Violent Man, coming out soon. And I'd love you to tell me what you think of any and all of those books. So stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.